Hello and welcome to a new video from Joggler66, Hour of the Truth. Now, since Brett was so inventious to make an intro and even an outro video to all my readings of the book reading of The Secret History of the Jesuits, as well as in German as in English, I don't need to do a long introduction what this video is all about. That is called The Jesuits in Europe during the 16th and 17th century. It deals, of course, with the book reading The Secret History of the Jesuits, a book by Edmond Paris, published in 1975. So without any further ado, I will address you to Chapter 1 of Section 2, Italy, Portugal and Spain, speaking about, learning about, teaching about the Jesuits. France, wrote Mr. Boehmer, is the cradle of the Society of Jesus, but in Italy it received its program and constitution. Therefore in Italy it first took root, and from there it spread abroad." Unquote. Now you will maybe ask yourself, how does it come? The Society of Jesus comes from France. Well, as we have learned in Section 1, you know that the oath the 6 founding Jesuits, Ignatius Loyola and 6 of his companions, took were in the Church of Notre Dame in Paris and in the Church of Saint-Denis in Paris. There they swore their oath and they founded the Society of Jesus. It was founded actually in France, but of course it was later ordained by Pope Paul III in 1540 in Rome. The author notes the increasing number of colleges and Jesuit academies, 128 in 1680. But, says he, the history of Italian civilization during the 16th and 17th century shows the results of it most strikingly. If a well-learned Italy thus embraced again the faith and ordinances of the Church, received a new zeal for asceticism and missions, composed again pious poems and hymns for the Church, dedicated conscientiously the painter's brushes and the sculptor's chisels to exalt the religious ideal, is it not because the cultivated classes were instructed in Jesuit colleges and confessionals? Gone were childish simplicity, joy, vivacity, and the simple love of nature. The Jesuits' pupils are far too clerical, devout, absorbed to preserve these qualities. They are taken up with ecstatic visions and illuminations. They literally get drunk with the paintings of frightful mortifications and the martyr's atrocious torments. They need the pomp, they need the glittering and theatrical. From the end of the 16th century on, Italian art and literature reproduce faithfully this moral transformation. The restlessness, the ostentation, the shocking claim which characterize the creations of that period promote a feeling of repulsion instead of sympathy for the beliefs they are supposed to interpret and glorify. It is the mark sui generis of the company. This love for the distorted, finicky, glittering, theatrical could seem strange amongst mystics formed by the spiritual exercises, if we did not detect in it this essentially Jesuitical aim to impress the mind. It is an application of the maxim, the end justifies the means, applied with perseverance by the Jesuits in the arts, literature, as well as politics and morals. Italy had been hardly touched by the Reformation. Nevertheless, the Valdenses, who had survived since the Middle Ages in spite of persecutions and established themselves in the north and south of the peninsula, joined the Calvinist Church in 1532. On a report from the Jesuit Posevino, Emmanuel Philibert of Savoy launched another bloody persecution against this heretic subjects in 1561. The same thing happened in Calabria, at Casal di San Sisto and Guardia Fiscale. Quote, "The Jesuits were implicated in these massacres. They were busy converting the victims." Unquote. As for Father Posevino, he followed the Catholic army as their chaplain, and recommended the extermination by fire of the heretic pastors as a necessary and holy act. The Jesuits were all-powerful in Parma, at the court of the Farnese, as well as in Naples during the 16th and 17th century. But in Venice, where they had been loaded with favors, they were banished on the 14th of May 1606, quote, as the most faithful servants and spokesmen of the Pope, unquote. They were nevertheless allowed to return in 1656, so just 50 years later. But their influence in the Republic was to be from now on but a shadow of the day they had in the past. Portugal was a choice country for the order. Already under John III, who reigned between 1521 and 1559, it was the most powerful religious community in the kingdom. Its influence grew even more after the Revolution of 1640, which put the Braganza on the throne. Under the first king of the House of Braganza, Father Fernandez was a member of the government, and, under the minority of Alphonse VI, the councillor most heeded by the regent Queen Louise, Father de Ville was successful in overthrowing Alphonse VI in 1667, and Father Emmanuel Fernandez was made a deputy to the Cortes in 1667 by the new King Peter II. In spite of the fact that the fathers were not fulfilling any public duty in the kingdom, they were more powerful in Portugal than in any other country. Not only were they spiritual advisors to all the royal family, but the king and his minister consulted them in all important circumstances. From one of their own testimonies we know that not one place in the administration of the state and church could be obtained without their consent, so much so that the clergy, the high classes, and the people contended with each other to win their favors and approval. Foreign politics were also under their influence. Any sensible man would see that such a state of affairs was unprofitable to the good of the kingdom. Well, let's go a little bit back into what I just read. It reads, not only were they spiritual advisors to all the royal family, still speaking about Portugal here, but the king and his minister consulted them in all important circumstances. Now, what is the difference with today, 2016, where we don't have a king anymore, for example in the United States of America, but a so-called president, and where we have a president like in Germany, then we have also a prime minister. What's the difference today? The Jesuits are still there consulted. The people who are in the positions of power today are all Jesuitical educated. Yeah, they come in the United States of America from Georgetown in university. They come, as Berner said so famously, from Fordham and Xavier University and all these Jesuitical universities. So they have all been indoctrinated with Jesuitical teaching. And the Jesuits, as it continues here to say, from one of their own testimonies, we know that not one place in the administration of the state and church could be obtained without their consent. So they have total control of state and church to put anybody of power in the right position. So much so that the clergy in high classes and the people contended with each other to win their favors and approval. If you do not have the approval of the Jesuits, and that was in the 16th and 17th century as in Portugal, as we read here in the book, the same as it is in the year 2016 in the United States of America and in the European Union. Actually, absolutely the same. The high classes and the people contended with each other to have to win their favors and approval of the Jesuits. Even foreign politics were also under their influence. Well, the School of Foreign Politics from Georgetown University is the one that actually tells the United States of America where their foreign policy is going to, and that is exactly the policy of the papacy that is done there. Yeah? Any sensible man would see that such a state of affairs was unprofitable for the good of the kingdom. Well, that's the reason why then, at those times, the Jesuits were thrown out of these countries, because the countries could not prosper anymore when the Jesuits were at the positions of power in those countries. Any sensible man would see that such a state of affairs was unprofitable to the good of the kingdom. Okay, reading on. In fact, we can see that the results by the decadent state into which this unfortunate land fell. All the enemy and perspicacity of the Marquess of Pombal in the middle of the 18th century were needed to tear Portugal out of the order's deadly grip. In Spain, the order's penetration was slower. The higher clergy and the Dominicans opposed it for a long time. Yeah, why did the Dominicans oppose it for a long time? I can tell you. Because we know that after the ordination by Pope Paul III of the Jesuit order in 1540, as we read in Rulers of Evil, it took them 2 years to negotiate to take over the Inquisition, and they took over the Inquisition from the Dominicans. But, of course, that was the Inquisition in all of Europe, not per se in Spain. And the Dominicans were not happy when the Jesuits wanted to take the Inquisition from them, because they thrived on that. They throve on that, I have to say. Yeah? It's the higher clergy and the Dominicans especially opposed it, meaning the ruling of the Jesuits in Spain, for a long time, because they wanted to rule themselves. Now the sovereigns themselves, Charles V and Philip II, while accepting their services, the Jesuit services, distrusted these soldiers of the Pope and feared encroachments on their authority. But, with much craftiness, the order eventually defeated this resistance. Quote, "During the 17th century they are all powerful in Spain, among the high classes and at court. Even Father Neidhart, former German cavalry officer, fully governed the kingdom as Councillor of State, Prime Minister and Grand Inquisitor. In Spain, as in Portugal, the kingdom's ruin coincided with the rise of the order." Unquote. Very important sentence. I hope that you understand that and then transfer that into the 21st century where we are living in. In Spain, as in Portugal, the kingdom's ruin coincided with the rise of the order. The more the United States of America and the European Union where I live in gets ruined, the higher the order of the Jesuit rises. Nothing new under the sun. Nothing's changed in these few hundred last years. Now this is what Edgar Quinet had to say about it. Quote, "Wherever a dynasty dies, I can see rising up and standing behind her a kind of bad genie, one of those dark figures that are the confessors, gently and paternally luring her towards death." Unquote. Indeed, one cannot impute Spain's decadence to this order only. Nevertheless, it is true that the Company of Jesus, together with the Church and other religious orders, hastened her fall. The richer the order became, the poorer Spain was. So much so that when Charles II died, the state's coffers did not even contain the necessary amount to pay for 10,000 masses, usually set for the salvation of a deceased monarch's soul. Did you listen carefully? I'm gonna repeat this very important part. The richer the order became, the poorer Spain was. The Order of the Jesuits is responsible for installing the Federal Reserve System in the United States of America. At this moment in 2016, the United States of America has, because of the Federal Reserve System, debts, I think, up to at least $30 trillion. At least. And all that richness goes to the Jesuits and the Vatican. Listen to Karen Hoodis. I am not very much in favor of that, madam, because of certain reasons, but there is some information that she brings out that is quite interesting and quite true. When she states that the money that is paid in the United States of America for the income tax goes right to the Jesuit order. So, when we read here about Spain and Portugal in the 16th and 17th century, that the richer the order became, the poorer Spain was, it is absolutely the same today for the United States of America and for us here in Europe, in the so-called European Union, the same thing. And just look at South America, where the Jesuits have had a grip on the country for a long time, how poor these countries are. Now we come into the next part of this reading that is dealing with the Jesuits in the 16th and 17th century in Germany, my home country. It was not Southern Europe, but Central Europe, France, Holland, Germany, Poland, which were the site for that historical struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism. So these countries were the main fields of battle for the Society of Jesus. The situation was particularly grave in Germany. Not only notorious pessimists, but also thinking and wise Catholics considered the old Church's cause in all German lands as almost lost. In fact, even in Austria and Bohemia, the break with Rome was so general that the Protestants could reasonably hope to conquer Austria within a few decades. Then how is it this change did not take place and the country was divided into two sections instead? The Catholic party, at the close of the 16th century, had no hesitation in answering this question, for it always acknowledged that the Wittelsbach, Habsburg and Jesuits were responsible for this happy turn of events. René Philipp Müller wrote about the Jesuits' role in these events. Quote, "The Catholic cause could hope for a real success only if the fathers were able to influence and guide the princes at all times and guiding the princes in all circumstances. The confessionals offered the Jesuits the means to secure a lasting political influence, therefore an effectual action." Unquote. In Bavaria, the young Duke Albert V, son of a zealous Catholic and educated at Ingolstadt, which you know from the University of Ingolstadt later on from Adam Weishaupt, who founded the Illuminati there, the old Catholic city called on the Jesuits to combat effectively the heresy. On the 7th of July 1556, 8 fathers and 12 Jesuit teachers entered Ingolstadt. It was the start of a new era for Bavaria. The state itself received a new seal. The Roman Catholic conceptions directed the politics of princes and the behaviors of the high classes. But this new spirit got hold of the higher classes only. It did not gain the hearts of the ordinary people. Nevertheless, under the iron discipline of the state and the restored church, they again became devout Catholics, docile, fanatic, and intolerant towards any heresy. It may seem excessive to attribute such prodigious virtues and actions to a mere handful of strangers. Yet, in the circumstances, their force was an inverse ratio to their number, and they were immediately effective as no obstacles were met. Loyola's emissaries, what a difficult word, Loyola's emissaries won the country's heart and mind from the start. From the next generation on, Ingolstadt became the perfect type of the German Jesuit city. One can judge that state of mind the fathers introduced to this stronghold of faith by reading the following. Quote, the Jesuit Meyerhofer of Ingolstadt taught in his Preacher's Mirror, quote, we will not be judged if we demand the killing of Protestants any more than we would by asking for the death penalty of thieves, murderers, counterfeiters, and revolutionaries. Unquote. So, what does this Jesuit Meyerhofer in Ingolstadt teach? We will not be judged if we demand the killing of Protestants any more than we would by asking for the death penalty on murderers, counterfeiters, and revolutionaries. But Protestants only have another faith. They only follow the Bible and the Bible alone. They only follow God and God alone for their conscience. They are not murderers, they are not counterfeiters, and they do not do revolutions. But still the Jesuit Meyerhofer teaches that Protestants should be killed as well as thieves, murderers, counterfeiters, and revolutionaries. So here is the big distinction that you always have to make. When Rome persecutes, it persecutes because of the belief that you have. When Protestants hang Catholics, which happened, I have no problem with admitting that, but that was only not because they were Catholics and because they had another belief system, but that was because they were instigators of revolutions, they were traitors, they were absolutely betraying their country, they were treasoners, especially when we go later into the reading of England. There you will see that, because there this happened, that some Catholics, Jesuits, were hanged and killed. Also in America that happened after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Yeah? The people responsible for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the Surratt family, Mary Surratt, and some others, were hanged. But not because of their belief system, but because of their actions, their treasonous actions they did to that country. But Jesuit Meyerhofer says, and you really have to let that sink that in and understand that, we will not be judged if we demand the killing of Protestants any more than we would by asking for the death penalty on thieves, murderers, counterfeiters, and revolutionaries. So someone with a different belief system is put in the same line as thieves, murderers, counterfeiters, and revolutionaries. Make up your own mind what you think about that. The successors of Albert V, and especially Maximilian, who reigned between 1597 and 1651, completed his work. But Albert V already was conscientious in his duty of assuring his subjects' salvation. As soon as the fathers arrived in Bavaria, so that's the Jesuits, huh? His attitude towards Protestants and those favorable to them became more severe. From 1563 on, he pitilessly expelled all recalcitrants, and had no mercy for the Anabaptists who had to suffer drownings, fire, prison and chains, all of which were praised by the Jesuit Agricola. In spite of all this, a whole generation of men had to disappear before the persecution was crowned a complete success. As late as 1586, the Moravian Anabaptists managed to hide 600 victims from the Duke Guillaume. This one example proves that there were thousands and not hundreds who were driven out, an awful breach into a thinly populated country. But, said Albert V to the Munich City Council, quote, God's honor and the salvation of souls must be placed above any temporal interests. Unquote. Little by little, all teaching in Bavaria was placed in the Jesuits' hands, and that land became the base for their penetration in eastern, western, and northern Germany. From 1585 on, the Fathers converted the part of Westphalia depending on Cologne. In 1586 they appear in Neuss and Bonn, one of Cologne's archbishop's residences. They opened colleges at Hildesheim in 1587 and Münster in 1588. This particular one already had 1,300 pupils in 1618. A large part of Western Germany was reconquered in that way by Catholicism. You can say that Germany's part of Bavaria is a little bit like Poland, even though that Bavaria never was Protestant and Poland was Protestant and turned within 50 years completely into Catholicism, as we will read later on. But even in in Bavaria, the Bible possession was forbidden, and when you had the Bible, you were burned at the stake in the 16th century. So the Protestant Reformation never really took hold on Bavaria. But anyway, we read along the last sentence here. A large part of Western Germany was reconquered in that way by Catholicism, thanks to the Wittelsbach and Jesuits. The alliance between the Wittelsbach and Jesuits was maybe even more important for the Austrian lands than for Western Germany. The Archduke Charles of Styria, last son of Emperor Ferdinand, married in 1571 a Bavarian princess, who brought into Graz Castle the narrow Catholic tendencies and the friendship for the Jesuits which prevailed at the court of Munich. Unquote. Under her influence, Charles worked hard to extirpate the heresy from his kingdom, and when he died in 1590, he made his son and successor Ferdinand swear that he would go on with this work. In any case, Ferdinand was well prepared for this. For 5 years he had been a pupil of the Jesuits at Ingolstadt. Besides, he was so narrow-minded that, to him, there was no nobler task than the re-establishment of the Catholic Church in his hereditary states. That this task was advantageous or not to his lands was of no concern to him. I prefer, he said, to reign over a country in ruins than over one that which is damned. In 1617, the Archduke Ferdinand was crowned King of Bohemia by the Emperor. Influenced by his Jesuit confessor Willer, Ferdinand started at once to combat Protestantism in his new kingdom. This signaled the start of that bloody war of religion which, for the next 30 years, kept Europe in suspense. When in 1618 the unhappy events in Prague gave the signal for open rebellion, the old Emperor Matthias tried at first to compromise, but he did not have enough power to make his intentions prevail against King Ferdinand, who was dominated by his Jesuit confessor. So the last hope to settle this conflict amicably was lost. Quote, at the same time, the lands of Bohemia had taken special measures and solemnly decreed that all Jesuits should be expelled, as they saw in them promoters of civil war. Soon after, Moravia and Silesia followed this example, and Protestants of Hungary, where the Jesuit Pasmani ruled with a rod of iron, rebelled also. But the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620 was won by Ferdinand, who had been made emperor again after the death of Matthias. The Jesuits persuaded Ferdinand to inflict the most cruel punishment on the rebels. Protestantism was rooted out of the whole country by means too terrible for words. At the end of the war, the country's material ruin was complete. The Jesuits Balbinus, Bohemia's historians, wondered how there could still be some inhabitants left in that country. But moral ruin was even more terrible. the flourishing culture found amongst the nobles and middle classes, the rich national literature which could not be replaced, all this had been destroyed, and even nationality had been abolished. Bohemia was open to the Jesuits' activities, and they burned Czech literature en masse. Under their influence, even the name of the nation's great saint, John Huss, gradually grew dimmer until it was extinct in the hearts of the people. The height of the Jesuit power, said Tomek, coincided with the country's greatest decadence in her national culture. It is because of the influence that order had that this unfortunate land's awakening came about 1 century too late. When the 30 Years' War came to an end, and the peace was concluded assuring German Protestants the same political rights enjoyed by the Catholics, the Jesuits did their uttermost to continue the fighting. It was in vain. But they obtained from their student Leopold I, then reigning emperor, the promise to persecute the Protestants in his own lands, and especially in Hungary. Quote, escorted by imperial dragoons, the Jesuits undertook this work of conversion in 1671. The Hungarians rose to action and started a war which was to last for nearly a whole generation. But that insurrection was victorious under the leadership of Francis Cacocci. The victor wanted to drive the Jesuits out of all the countries which fell under his power, but influential protectors of the order managed to adjourn these measures, and the expulsion did not take place until 1707. Prince Eugene blamed with a harsh frankness the politics of the imperial house and the intrigues of the Jesuits in Hungary. He wrote, quote, Austria nearly lost Hungary because of their persecuting of the Protestants. Unquote. One day he bitterly exclaimed that the morals of the Turks were far superior to those of the Jesuits, in practice at least. Quote, not only do they want to dominate consciences, but also to have the right of life and death over men. Unquote. That is the point. They do not only want to dominate the conscience, but they want to have the right of life and death over every man that rules there. This is in accordance with the bull Unam Sanctam from Pope Boniface VIII from 1302, which states it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. So if you are not subject to the Roman Pontiff, you are so-called dead already, because you are not saved. And when you are dead already, well, you can be killed without any problem, as we have read already a page or two earlier, when I was stating that we will not be judged if we demand the killing of Protestants any more than we would by asking for the death penalty of thieves, murderers, counterfeiters, and revolutionaries. You see how the same policy always comes back again? Austria and Bavaria reaped the fruits of Jesuit domination in full. The compression of all progressive tendencies and the systematic stultification of the people. The deep misery which followed the War of Religion, meaning the 30-Year War between 1618 and 1648, the deep misery which followed the War of Religion, the powerless politics, the intellectual decadence, the moral corruption, a frightful decrease in the population and impoverishment of the whole of Germany, these were the results of the Order's actions. You have to understand that in this 30-year war between 1618 and 1648, at least 12 million German Protestants died. That's about a third of the population in the whole country of that time. What do you think would happen when you erase a third of the population of the United States of America in a 30-year war? Think of that when you hear me reading about the 30-year war in Europe. and exterminating a third of the population. Maybe that is a kind of imagination that you can have any idea of the consequences that would bear for that in your country where you are living in. Because this all sounds so far away. Almost 400 years in the past, far from the United States of America, where you maybe sit and read this along with me or hear this now. But 1/3 of your country erased because of religious reasons within 30 years, a 30 years bloody war. Think about how you would feel if that happened to your country, and if your country had to live with a history like that. Well, we come to chapter 3 and read about Switzerland and the Jesuits in the 16th and 17th century in that country of Europe. It was only during the 17th century that the Jesuits succeeded in establishing themselves successfully in Switzerland after having been called, then banished, by a few cities of the Confederation during the second half of the 16th century. The Archbishop of Milan, Charles Borromée, who had favored their installation at Lucerne in 1578, soon realized what the results of their actions would be, as we are reminded by J. Huber. Quote, Charles Borromée wrote to his confessor that the Company of Jesus, governed by heads more political than religious, is becoming too powerful to preserve the necessary moderation and submission. She rules over kings and princes and governs temporal and spiritual affairs. Now, isn't this exactly what it is written in the Bible? Revelation 17. And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Isn't this what I've just read to you exactly what is written in the Bible? The Company of Jesus, governed by heads more political than religious, is becoming too powerful to preserve the necessary moderation and submission. She rules over kings and princes and governs temporal and spiritual affairs. The pious institution has lost the spirit which animated her originally. We shall be compelled to abolish it. That's a very nice quote, but the last sentence, the pious institution has lost the spirit which animated her originally. No, only if you misunderstand that spirit that has inspired that institution from the beginning. That was never inspired by Jesus Christ. It was always inspired by the devil. We shall compel to abolish it? Yeah, that would be something. Now, at the same time in France, the famous legal expert Etienne Pasquier wrote, quote, Introduce this order in our midst, and at the same time you will introduce dissension, chaos, and confusion. Unquote. Introduce the order of the Jesuits in our midst, and at the same time you will introduce dissension, chaos, and confusion. Hello, America 2016. Have a look at your country. The Jesuits are planted everywhere. You have more than 28 Jesuit universities. You have hundreds of Catholic high schools. You have famous Jesuit institutions like Georgetown University, Xavier University, Loyola University, Fordham University, Notre Dame University, and there are all the people of this order in the midst of your land, and as Etienne Pasquier wrote it here and this time, you will introduce dissension, chaos, and confusion. Exactly what is happening over there. And sorry, I'm here in Europe, am not better. They did the same over here. I cannot even find a school in my neighborhood that is not Jesuit or Catholic controlled. But we have to understand where the real enemy is. Rome. Is it not this identical complaint heard over and over again, and in all countries, against the company? It was the same in Switzerland when the evidence of her evil deeds broke through the flattering appearances with which she excelled in covering herself. Like the pagan Roman Caesarian political empire covered itself with the garments of Christianity. Wherever the Jesuits managed to take root, they seduced great and small. They seduced young and old. Very soon, the authorities would start consulting them in important circumstances. Their donations started flowing in, and it was not long before they occupied all the schools, the pulpits of most churches, the confessionals, and all high-ranking and influential people, confessors looking after the education of all classes of society, counselors and intimate friends of members of the council. Their influence grew day after day, and they did not wait long before exercising it in public affairs. Lucerne and Freiburg were their main centers. From there, they conducted the exterior politics of most Catholic cantons. Any plan forged in Rome or by other foreign powers against Protestantism in Switzerland was assured of the Jesuits' full support. In 1620 they were successful in making the Catholic population of the Veltlin rise against the Protestants, and they slaughtered 600. The Pope gave indulgence to all those who took part in that horrible deed. So, when you are killing a Protestant here in Veltlin, you are given indulgence by the Pope for that deed. Means it is a meritorious work to kill a Protestant. As I read to you in Rulers of Evil, when we were speaking about this little document called the Directorium Inquisitorum. Look that up again and you will find it. It's in my reading of Rulers of Evil. Directorium Inquisitorum. You can also Google it and find it out for yourself. In 1656, the author continues, in 1656 they kindled civil war between members of the various confessions. Later again, a new war of religion was started by the Jesuits. In 1712, peace was being discussed in Arau. Lucerne and Uri had just accepted it when the Jesuits, on an order from Rome, did all they could to reverse things. They refused absolution to all those who would hesitate to take up arms. They proclaimed loudly from their pulpits that one was not obliged to keep his word when it was given to heretics. They made moderate councillors to suspect, tried to remove them from their posts, and provoked in Lucerne such a threatening uprising of the people against the government that the supreme authority resigned herself to break the peace. The Catholics were defeated in the fight which followed and signed a ponderous peace. But let me just go back to this little sentence that I just read here. They refused absolution to all those who would hesitate to take up arms. They proclaimed loudly from their pulpits that one was not obliged to keep his word when it was given to heretics. Isn't this, what I just read here, something that you always hear of the so-called conspiracy of the Jews? That they can do anything if it is to a so-called Goyim? Well, do you see where that deception comes from? From the Roman Catholic Church, from the Jesuits themselves. They proclaimed loudly from their pulpits that one was not obliged to keep his word when it was given to heretics. The end justifies the means. Mental reservation. I can call in mental reservation because the end justifies the means, that in the end the church is the gainer of all actions. Since all that time, the order's influence in Switzerland became smaller and smaller. Today, Article 51 of the Swiss Constitution forbids the Society of Jesus to hold any cultural or educative activity on the territory of the Confederation, and efforts made to abolish this rule have always been defeated. And now I have to make a little comment. The problem is that when you want to look that up on the internet, I can only find a German comment on that. So I will read this here and translate it as good as I can. So these articles 51 and 52 of the Bundesverfassung, means the Constitution from Switzerland, that disallowed the Jesuits from 1874, is abolished on the 20th of May 1973, just to make it short. And in my German video there will probably a link to the Wikipedia where you can find it and read that for yourself, but I'm not going to translate that whole little article here. But the point is that by a how do you call that, by a referendum in the 20th of May in 1973, these Jesuitical articles that the Jesuits were forbidden in Switzerland are taken out of the Constitution. So today, of course, since more than 60 years already, the Order of the Jesuits, of course, is not forbidden anymore in Switzerland. Coming to the next part, Poland and Russia. A little bit of Poland I gave already away, but that's no problem. Jesuit domination was nowhere as deadly as it was in Poland. This is proved by Börner, a moderate historian who does not bear any systematic hostility towards the society. Quote, and there are a lot of quotes from his work, so I will not always say quote when it comes, but the Jesuits were entirely responsible for Poland's annihilation. The accusation so worded is excessive. The decadence of the Polish state had started before they came on the scene, but they undoubtedly hastened the kingdom's decomposition. Of all the states, Poland, who had millions of Orthodox Christians in their midst, should have had religious tolerance as one of the most essential principles of her interior politics. The Jesuits did not allow that. They did worse. They put Poland's exterior politics at the service of Catholic interests in a fatal manner. Unquote. Now, listen very carefully, very carefully. This was written at the end of the last century, meaning the 19th century. It is very similar to what Colonel Beck, former Polish Foreign Affairs Minister from 1932 to 1939, said after the war from 1939 to 1945. But let me make sure that you get that. The first quote that I read from the book from Burma, that ended with saying they put Poland's exterior politics at the service of Catholic interests in a fatal manner, exactly the same as the United States exterior politics is put in the Catholic interest through Georgetown University and their school of foreign politics over there. Exactly the same thing. This was written in the 19th century. Now we read what did Colonel Beck say, who was a former Polish Foreign Affairs Minister from 1932 through 1939, and what did he say after the Second World War? Quote, "The Vatican is one of the main causes of the tragedy of my country. I realized too late that we had pursued our foreign politics just to serve the interests of the Catholic Church." Unquote. Did you get that? Did you understand that well enough? The Vatican is one of the main causes of the tragedy of my country, says this former Polish Foreign Affairs Minister. I realized too late that we had pursued our foreign politics just to serve the interests of the Catholic Church, meaning their foreign politics did not serve their country, it served the politics of the Roman Catholic Church. United States of America, your foreign politics just serves the first beast of Revelation 13, the Antichrist. You are fighting the crusades of the Pope. Your foreign policy in the United States of America only serves the interest of the Roman Catholic Church. We over here in Europe are not better. Don't get me wrong. I don't say that. But the United States of America is the most powerful military in the world. Why? Because it was raised from the Jesuits from the beginning. The second beast does the bidding of the first beast. United States foreign politics is just to serve the interests of the Roman Catholic Church. Being patriotic of your country, alright. Being patriotic of your military that only goes somewhere else to serve the interests of the Roman Catholic Church? I don't think so. Now think again. When you are standing in a football stadium, putting your hand on your heart and singing your national anthem full proud, think of who really makes your foreign and domestic policy. It is only done to serve the interests of the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of Antichrist, the Church of Satan. So with several centuries in between, the same disastrous influence has made its mark once again on that unfortunate nation of Poland. In 1581 already Father Posavino, pontifical legate in Moscow, has done his best to bring together the Tsar Ivan the Terrible and the Roman Church. Ivan was not strictly against it. Full of glad hopes, Posavino made himself in 1584 the mediator of the peace of Kirovoa Gora between Russia and Poland, a peace which saved Ivan from inextricable difficulties. This is just what the crafty sovereign had hoped for. There was no more talk of converting the Russians. Posavino had to leave Russia without having obtained anything. 2 years later, an even better opportunity offered itself to the fathers of the Jesuits to get a hold on Russia. Grishka Obstrepiev, an unfrocked monk, revealed to a Jesuit that he actually was Dmitri, son of Tsar Ivan, who had been assassinated. He declared himself ready to subdue Moscow for Rome if he was master of the Tsar's throne. Without thinking it over first, the Jesuits took it into their hands to introduce Ostrepiev to the Palatine of Sandomir, who gave him his daughter in marriage. They spoke on his behalf to King Sigismund III and the Pope regarding his expectations, and succeeded in making the Polish army rise against the Tsar Boris Godunov. As a reward for these services, the false Dmitri renounced the religion of his fathers at Kraskowi, one of the Jesuits' houses, and promised the order and establishment in Moscow near the Kremlin after his victory over Boris. Quote, "But it was these favors from the Catholics which unleashed the hatred of the Russian Orthodox Church against Dmitri. On the 27th of May 1606 he was massacred with several hundred Polish followers. Until then one could hardly speak of a Russian national sentiment, but now This feeling was very strong and took immediately the form of a fanatical hatred for the Roman Church and Poland. The alliance with Austria and the offensive politics of Sigismund III against the Turks, all of which were strongly encouraged by the order, were just as disastrous for Poland. To put it briefly, no other state suffered as much as Poland did under the Jesuits' domination. And in no other country apart from Portugal was the society so powerful. Not only did Poland have a king of the Jesuits, but also a Jesuit king, Jean Casimir, a sovereign who had belonged to the order before his accession to the throne in 1649. Quote, "While Poland was heading fast towards ruin, the number of Jesuit establishments and schools was growing so fast that the general made Poland into a special congregation in 1751. And I have to add a little note from me here that I read already in a radio broadcast that I did a few years ago with Walt Stickle called Jesuits Derooting the Reformation. And I think if I think of it, I will put the link of that into the description box of the video, and you can listen to those 7 broadcasts over there. Jesuits Derooting the Reformation. At that time, I found out and wrote about Poland the following. Poland may be thoroughly Catholic today, but the Reformation made great progress in that country in the middle and later 1500s. It is a prime example of the weakness of the reforming movement and the success of the Catholic Reformation. Students from Wittenberg, where Luther came from, brought the reforming message early to Danzig and Krakow. But here as elsewhere, national sentiments directly affected the course of the reform movement. Partly because of Polish political traditions, partly because of a long-standing ties with France, and partly because of a growing antipathy towards Germans, the Poles took much more strongly to Calvinism and Calvinistic sects. It's worth pointing out too that the Hussites had flourished in Western Poland, so the country had a long tradition of dissatisfaction with the clergy. Moreover, the country also had a long tradition in religious toleration. Many Jews had fled thither from persecutions in the West, and there was even an Islamic Tatar population in Lithuania. In the event, a number of different Reformed churches took root in Poland, especially during the 1540s and 1550s. While ideas and enclaves could be found everywhere, different flavors of Protestantism flourished in different regions of Poland, for exactly the same reason they did in Germany, due to the preferences and protection of the local nobility. But the biggest success of anti-reformatical works of the Order of the Jesuits will be explained in the Wikipedia link in Poland, where the nobility in the 16th century was Protestant. Polish kings were Catholic, like for example King Sigismund III that we spoke about was Jesuit trained. Since 1717 it is forbidden to buy new Protestant churches in Poland, and every since 1632 built church, Protestant church, was torn down. If you are falling away from the Catholic belief system now, you will be punished by death. The Jesuits succeeded within just half a century to establish Catholicism completely in that once Protestant country of Poland. Now we go into the next part, chapter 5, Sweden and England. Still talking about the Jesuit order in the 16th and 17th century. In the Scandinavian countries, wrote Mr. Pierre Dominique, Lutheranism submerged everything else, and when the Jesuits made their counterattack, they did not find what was found in Germany. A Catholic party already in the minority, but still strong. Their only hope then was in the conversion of the sovereign, who was secretly in favor of Catholicism. Also, this king John III Vasa had married in 1568 a Polish princess, Catherine, a Roman Catholic. In 1574, Father Nikolai and other Jesuits were brought to the recently established School of Theology, where they became fervent Roman proselytizers while officially assuming Lutheranism. Then the clever negotiator Possevino secured the conversion of John III and the care of educating his son Sigismund, the future Sigismund III, King of Poland, as we just read in the chapter before. When the time came to submit Sweden to the Holy See, the king's conditions, marriage of priests, use of the vernacular in services and communion in both kinds, meaning bread and wine being given to the faithful, all of which had been rejected by the Roman Curia, brought the negotiations to a dead end. In any case, the king who had lost his first wife had remarried a Swedish Lutheran. The Jesuits, as a result, had to leave the country. 50 years later, the order won another great victory in Sweden. Queen Christine, daughter of Gustav Adolf, the last of the Vasas, was converted under the teaching of two Jesuit professors who had managed to reach Stockholm pretending to be traveling Italian noblemen. But in order to change her religion without conflicts, she had to abdicate on the 24th of June 1654. So far for Sweden. In England, on the other hand, the situation seemed more favorable to the society, and it could hope, for a while at least, to bring this country back under the Holy See's jurisdiction. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, Ireland was still entirely Catholic and England 50% so. In 1542 already, Selmerin and Brute had been sent by the Pope to survey Ireland. Seminaries had been created under the Jesuits' direction in Douai, Pont-à-Mousson and Rome, with a view to train English, Irish and Scottish missionaries. In agreement with Philip II of Spain, the Roman Curia worked at overthrowing Elizabeth in favor of the Catholic Mary Stuart. An Irish uprising provoked by Rome had been crushed, but the Jesuits, who had arrived in England in 1580, took part in a large Catholic assembly at Southwark. Then, under diverse disguises, they spread from country to country, from country house to castle. In the evening they would hear confession. In the morning they would preach and give communion, and they would disappear as mysteriously as they had arrived. For from the 15th of July Elizabeth had proscribed them. They printed and distributed secretly virulent pamphlets against the Queen and the Anglican Church. One of them, Father Campion, was caught, condemned for high treason, and hanged. That's why I mentioned that half an hour ago in the reading here. Why was he hanged? Not because of his belief system, which is Roman Catholic, but because of his treason against the state and against the legitimate Protestant Queen. They also plotted at Edinburgh to win to their cause King James of Scotland. The result of all these disturbances was the execution of Mary Stuart in 1587. Then came the Spanish expedition, the Invincible Armada, which made England tremble for a while and brought about the sacred union around Elizabeth's throne. But the company, meaning the company of Jesus, pursued nonetheless her projects and was training English priests at Valladolid, Seville, Madrid and Lisbon, while her secret propaganda continued in England under the direction of Father Garnet. After the Gunpowder Plot against James I, successor of Elizabeth, this Father Garnet was condemned for complicity and hanged, like Father Campion. I don't think that I have to go deeply into the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Remember, the 5th of November, the Gunpowder Plot, a day never to be forgot. where Guy Fawkes and other Jesuit conspirators with 36 barrels of gunpowder wanted to blow up the Parliament and the King and the whole Protestant English government at that time, and by that they would have stopped the board that was set in, this 9 groups of 6 people who were writing the King James Bible that started in 1604. But luckily, because our God, our Father, had his hand in it, this gunpowder plot did not succeed, and King James I was able to publish the King James Bible a few years later in 1611. Under Charles I, then in Cromwell's Commonwealth, other Jesuits paid for their intrigues with their lives. The order thought it would triumph under Charles II, who, together with Louis XIV, had concluded a secret treaty at Dover, pledging to restore Catholicism in the land. The nation was not fully informed of these circumstances, but the little that transpired was enough to create an unbelievable agitation. All England shuddered before Loyola's spectre and the Jesuit conspiracies. A meeting of them in the palace itself brought popular fury to a head. Charles II, who enjoyed the life of a king and did not want to go on another journey across the seas, hanged 5 fathers for high treason at Tyburn. This did not abate the Jesuits. However, Charles II was too prudent and too cynical for their liking, always ready to drop them. They thought victory was in sight when James II acceded to the throne. In fact, the king took up Mary Tudor's old game, meaning persecuting Protestants, but used softer means. He pretended to convert England and established for the Jesuits at the Palace of Savoy a college where 400 students immediately took residence. A downright camarilla of Jesuits took over the palace. All these combinations were the main cause for the 1688 glorious revolution. The Jesuits had to go against a stream too powerful. Then England had 20 Protestants for each Catholic. The king was overthrown, all the members of the company put in prison or banished. For some time the Jesuits recommenced their work of secret agents, but it was nothing more than a futile agitation. They had lost the cause. At this moment, but with the Oxford movement and the liberation, the liberation law that I read about in the book before, All Roads Lead to Rome, there of course the Jesuits came back. And I will finish in this section for today. I will leave chapter 6, France, for the next time, because this is a few pages and we have already done a little bit more than an hour. So I will leave it up to here and see you next time when we will read about the Jesuit order in the 16th and 17th century in France, and then go on with another part of the book later. I thank you very much for listening and watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you've learned something as always. And well, I also learned something, and especially learning something and doing these comments, which I very, very much like to do. So, until next time, God bless you, and Joggler66 from Hour of the Truth signing off. Bye bye.
Especially I work in dealing with the infiltration of churches and religious institutions as well as government. That cover a tremendous number of institutions.
And the purpose of that infiltration was what for?
Well, the purpose is what the Roman Catholic system has all the time as her own purpose, is to infiltrate, to penetrate all the areas of life where the Roman Catholic can have control and access for the coming world government.
Simply put, this country and this world benefit from your commitment to Jesuit principles, to being men.
As a graduate of another great Jesuit institution, Xavier University, I have great affection for the value and purpose of a Jesuit education.
What that means is, in preparation for that world government, the Roman Catholic institution, especially since the establishment of the Jesuit order in 1541, throughout all these 500 years, they've been in preparation and through infiltration and penetration of every level of society in order to take over the world politically and religiously.
What a beautiful day the Lord has made. Holy Father, on behalf of Michelle and myself, welcome to the White House.
There are two doctrines that define very well these dangerous goals of the Roman Catholic institution. Two doctrines define this very well. One is called the doctrine of the apostolic succession, and that is dealing with the papacy. And the other is the doctrine, the temporal power, and that is dealing with world government. Of course, both, because you can see that even the Pope and his own individual office, he meet those requirements. He is not only the head of his church, as he called himself, John Paul II, the present Pope. He said he is the pastor of his church. He is not only that, but he is the head of his state.
It is a sign, perhaps, of how far we have come in this country that today's news of formal recognition between the governments of the United States and the Vatican did not create a furor. Once upon a time, it would have. Once upon a time, and not all that long ago, it did.
From the time of President Washington, that was the first president to be utilized by the Jesuits. If you were not aware of that, President Washington already was initiated by the Jesuits to bring about the first communication with the Vatican ever known in this country. From there on, President Reagan, throughout all this time, President Reagan has come to fulfill the greatest moment in the history of this conspiracy.